What was Joe Biden thinking the day that he decided he would not seek re-election in 2024? What was going on in that Delaware House? What were his advisors saying to him? What was Jill saying to him? What was Hunter saying to him on speakerphone from LA? Well, the New York Times has an article that supposedly outlines everything that happened the weekend that Joe Biden decided he would not seek re-election. Just to set the context here, the New York Times does a pretty long, lengthy, well, here's what was going on. Remember, Joe Biden had COVID. He was at his Delaware beach house. Jill was there. A couple advisors were there. Hunter kept calling in from Los Angeles, where he lives. And that's when the decision supposedly got made or made for him. I'm not entirely sure what. But while we read this, I want to tell you, I'm going to call balls and strikes here, I think, because there are things that I actually think probably did happen. And I think those things are fascinating. The conversation he had with his chief of staff, his political advisors, with Jill, with Hunter, I think that's actually really interesting. The parts that I don't think are fascinating as to why he did it, and painting him as this enlightened figure of American politics that decided to put his country before himself. I don't believe that part for a second. But given that context, we will start the article here. Again, this is from the New York Times, talking about what was going on in the mind of Joe Biden when he made that decision. It was not about the polls, people close to Biden say. Despite everything, Mr. Biden believed he could still claim the Democratic nomination and beat former President Donald J. Trump. Aides say that he still believes that. Well, the fact that he still believes that he could beat Donald Trump, that part is crazy. What I think is interesting is that, well, he still believed he could get the Democratic nomination. Well, yeah, you got all of the primary votes. You have all of the support from your party, at least from a delegate standpoint. It would be weird to think that you couldn't get that. Anyways, it goes on. What began to change the president's mind, people familiar with his thinking say, was the realization that if he stayed in the race, he was in for a lonely battle that would rip apart the Democratic Party, the cause he had served nearly his entire adult life. Would a man who views himself as the ultimate consensus builder in Washington want to wage an inter-party war that could run counter to the fabric of who he is? That is the part that I think is a load of baloney. Remember, he knows at this point that the entirety of the Democratic leadership is not on his team. They've called for his resignation. This is after his disastrous performance in the debate. Everybody in the Democratic side was saying, you got to step down. You got to step aside. Nancy, I'm sure, got to him saying, hey, we can either do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. That had to be in his thinking. So the idea that the decision was made because, well, he just doesn't want to have his legacy be ruined, I think is nonsense. That day, I think this is Saturday that they're talking about, Mr. Biden asked a key question. If we were going to do it, said Mr. Biden to his two advisors, what would we say? Yet those in his small circle of family members and advisors who were with the president at this very instant that the story went from Mr. Biden's defiance to acquiescence was not about convincing him that he was going to lose. That part, again, that's not, I call a BS on that. It had nothing to do with the polls. It had nothing to do with the fact that he was going to get mopped in the actual general election. No, what it had to do with, as they'll say here, was, well, he just couldn't do that to his party. That never happened, according to people close enough to Mr. Biden's thinking. People close to the president said that no one hid the grim realities from him, but that never stopped him in believing he could be the party's nominee. Again, of course you would believe that, had he stayed in the race, and he could beat Donald Trump. Just days before the letter was drafted in Rehoboth, Mr. Biden received a call from Ron Klain, the president's chief of staff, who urged him to stay in the race. That's my intention, Mr. Biden told Klain on Friday evening. So Friday evening, his chief of staff calls him and says, Mr. President, you should stay in the race. And he says, that's what I'm planning on doing. But it wasn't about the polls. It wasn't about anything that said Joe Biden was going to lose in historic fashion. No, that had nothing to do with it. What it was, well, we'll continue to go on. Now, they list two names of political advisors to the president. I'm just going to say the two guys because I don't feel like pronouncing their names constantly. But I thought this is the deviation from the conversations going around in Joe Biden's inner circle. And I just thought this was hilarious, especially Joe Biden being a lifelong public servant. He committed his life to public service, and then, of course, forwent so many of the advantages had he not been a public servant. I don't know if this paragraph was put in there intentionally or what, but it says this: the three men, Joe Biden and his two advisors, moved to the screened-in porch at the back of the 7,000 square foot home, close to where the waves crashed on the beach. Hunter Biden dialed in on speakerphone. 7,000 square foot house with a screened-in porch on the water? Yeah, really screams public service. He's in it for the right reasons. Multi-million-dollar house, public service, my butt. But back to the actual conversation at hand. This is apparently on Saturday. Instead, he said nothing to challenge the accuracy of the polls and did not ask them to get additional data, even weeks earlier publicly questioning the accuracy of those polls, according to people familiar with the conversation. Instead, he asked them about what had been unthinkable, dropping out of the race. He wanted to get some words down on the page, and a draft announcement was assembled. The three men came out of the talks with each other. Mr. Biden did not explicitly announce the decision, but to people in the room, he was leaning towards stepping aside, which did not appear to shock anybody. So this is Saturday afternoon. They go and huddle on the screened 7,000 square foot home's porch. And he says, well, what would happen if we did do it? And then they come back in the room. He says, well, we're thinking about it. And nobody is shocked. None of his staff, nobody in the room is shocked at all by this announcement. It was clear to everyone in the room, which did not appear shocking. He directed the two advisors to work on a statement while the others took a pizza break for dinner. When the president and the two political advisors convened again, they continued working on the statement until the president said he was going to bed. He went to sleep. He wanted to sleep on it. The next day, he ended his re-election campaign in a brief letter posted to social media, bringing a half a century of service near to its close. The decision would cement his legacy as a one-term president and instantly reshape the 2024 election. That part of it is true. But this is where the article ends, and I think that this is a fascinating place for this thing to end. Because what you see, at least if we're painting a picture of what happened, is on Friday, he tells his chief of staff, I'm planning on staying in. The chief of staff says, no, you got to stay in, Mr. President. He says, yeah, I'm absolutely doing it. Then Saturday, knowing that he's completely alone on an island, he triumphantly makes the decision to not tear apart the party that he so loves. I don't believe that at all. I think it was it's purely a personal thing. But aside from all that, Saturday afternoon happens. He meets with his advisors. They kind of reconvene later in the evening. He says, hey, draft up a statement. Then he says, I want to sleep on it. Then the article ends there. Right? What happens on Sunday morning? So a statement is drafted. He goes to bed. Then what? I'm curious about that. And maybe the New York Times didn't get any of that information, but I have to believe that the people that were speaking on in terms of anonymity, who were able to talk about this, I'm sure they told them what happened on Sunday morning. Why didn't the New York Times report on that? That's what I'm super fascinated about. He told them, hey, draft a statement. Maybe on Sunday morning he woke up and just was in a daze. Didn't know where he was, didn't know who he was talking to. Again, I don't know. But considering the fact that all of that is left up to the interpretation of the reader because they didn't tell you what happened, who's to say? But that's apparently how it unfolded. I don't buy the fact that Joe Biden did it solely because he didn't want to erode the fabric of the Democratic Party. Get out of here with that crap. He didn't do it. He didn't want to run because his brain doesn't work and he was going to lose 48 states. That's what is happening. But I do think it's fascinating that he was down to like the last 5 people who believed that he could still possibly win. Even those 5 people were telling him the polls, and he thought, dang, this is going to be an uphill battle. Now, a lot of those people were still saying, hey, stay in the race, Mr. President. But I think at that point, even his riddled brain could understand that there was no hope in an electoral victory, and he didn't want to get embarrassed. That has nothing to do with not wanting to tear apart the Democratic Party, because to this day, people are still close to him in his circle. People are still saying that he's angry and resentful about the people that forced him out. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, all of your Democrat powerhouses. He's still mad at them. So if it were because he didn't want to tear apart the Democratic Party, now it's because he knew he was going to lose in tremendous fashion and wanted to save himself the embarrassment, because everything in his mind is about him. So I don't know. I thought that was a fascinating story from the New York Times. I believe most of it, aside from the reasoning, but crazy times.